CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.
Welcome to yet another episode on Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beginkos Moyo, the Director of the Centre on African Philanthropy and Social Investment. Today I'm really excited and a bit nervous to be joined by Gerry Salole. Gerry is an independent consultant right now, but as we are going to have this conversation, we'll go through some of the positions that he has held. The recent being the Chief Executive of the European Foundation Centre, now called Philia. Gerry, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to start with where we are right now in Sali, our 4th annual conference on African philanthropy. You have been one of the people that has been instrumental in the development of this sector in Africa. And TrustAfrica is one of the organizers, and you played a huge contribution. Akwasi was telling us last night how at some point in the time of the Ford Foundation, and you were an executive there was a bit of some economic boom and some money that was available, and you spearheaded the conversation around setting up an African foundation. Could we talk about the genesis of that idea, but also the whole journey around setting up TrustAfrica?
So indeed, in about 2001, 2002, the Ford Foundation realized it had resources, and they wanted to set up a 5th office in possibly in the Congo, and they had that idea in their heads. And the 4 representatives, Akwasi was one of them, the representative from Nairobi, Catherine Pearson, and the representative in Egypt, who was then Steve. All agreed. We met, we had a retreat in Kenya, and we agreed that it would be better to try and persuade Ford to do something a little bit more radical, to create an African foundation that had its own sort of endowment. That's what the original idea was. We didn't have a name. The 4 of us, I think, managed to put together a very convincing argument, and Ford Foundation bought into it. And they were quick enough to get into it. And once they bought into it, then of course it went through many iterations. Different people in the Ford Foundation did different tasks. And Akwasi, of course, played the most difficult role of incubating it within the Ford Foundation for a number of years, when it was called the Special Initiative for Africa. But it was a collective effort, right? So I'm just trying to emphasize how we were lucky that the 4 of us thought along the same way, and that there was no, different arguments or different attitudes coming from the 4 reps. That really helped.
Yeah, and then you went on to chair the board of TrustAfrica. Maybe there are some moments that you want to refer to, in terms of maybe some of the, not necessarily challenges, but there are barriers in setting up institutions in the continent. Could we talk about some of those maybe moments where you felt we wanted to do this, but it's proving to be difficult, and some of the opportunities that presented themselves to building an institution that we now have?
So, I mean, the most fundamental, I think, problem we had, Becky, was the fact that we were getting funding from one foundation, and it meant that other foundations quickly lost interest in funding. And indeed, because the money was coming from abroad, our dream was to see if there was a way of tapping into resources on the continent that we think are there, and we thought were there. And we were unable, in a way, I think, successfully to leverage the outside funding with as much local funding as I think we would have liked. We always thought if we had the stimulus of the Ford Foundation money, we would be able to grow TrustAfrica appropriately with local resources. And we tried many different things. If you remember, we were thinking maybe we could get African Airlines to dedicate a certain amount of money, etc., and so on. It just didn't happen. It never took off. So that's probably the biggest frustration. The other thing is essentially that if you have funding from outside, your authenticity as a local player gets called into question. And so it took a considerable amount of time and energy for TrustAfrica to establish the kind of trust it needed in the African context. I think it has it now, but at the beginning it didn't. And of course you had some time in TrustAfrica, you will remember how difficult it is to persuade people to trust you if they see you, perceive you as an outside agent.
Yeah. And then of course, I think during your time as the board chair of TrustAfrica, you were the chief executive of the European Foundation Centre. And one of the innovations that I personally, as the person who was working in Africa but also for TrustAfrica, was the ability for African foundations like TrustAfrica to actually partake as members of the European Foundation Centre. Maybe we talk a bit about that and how it affected the global perception of African philanthropy.
So my dream, again, this is another, as an old man, I'm looking back and thinking, I wish I could have done things differently. I thought I could persuade more European foundations to work in Africa when I went to the EFC from Johannesburg. And I think I succeeded with one or two, but the vast majority have basically stayed very tied into local funding. However, it was extremely important to have African foundations represented at the governing council, in meetings, and articulate their own perspective. I'll never forget Bongi Makabele coming to Rome and giving a presentation right next to the Italian president. And she was challenging this group of European funders really about fundamentals in their behavior. That's the kind of thing I think that I'm very proud we were able to do.
Yeah. And then in your time at the European Foundation Centre, which if my calculations are right, were over 10 years.
About 15.
15 years, what would you say were some of the key issues that occupied you for the 15-year period, and some of the legacy points that we can talk about?
The most important thing that happened was the crisis that happened in 2010, the financial crisis, where it became very clear that the European foundations had investment strategies that did not compare favorably with American foundations' investment strategies, so that the American foundations bounced back within a year and a half to 2 years, 3 years of when the crisis hit. It took European foundations a lot longer. So I began to understand that the beasts were quite different from each other. And that led to then more understanding that you really do need to take the time to unpack the spectrum of different kinds of foundations, because we treat them as if they're all the same. We don't recognize that they're governed differently, they handle their endowments differently, they handle their grantees differently, they handle whether they're operational or not differently. So what we developed at DFC when I was there was this spectrum of philanthropy which allowed you to narrow in on what foundations had in common with each other, but also how they differed. And we moved away from what had been the way of thinking of foundations before I came to the EFC, which was very much mirroring the American model. We have private foundations, community foundations, corporate foundations, and political entities that are sort of think tanks. And it became really important to disaggregate all of that, because Europe is different. And that then led, of course, to a recognition that there is a different kind of philanthropy on this continent that has its own legitimacy and doesn't need to look like or feel like US philanthropy.
And then, obviously, a 15-year journey is a long journey. There would have been some moments where you also encountered some challenges and some barriers. Are there any that come to mind, and how did you mitigate them?
I didn't mitigate all the barriers I came across, but yes, some of the most important things that were very clear to me was that bigger foundations have bigger voices. So how do you marry smaller foundations with bigger ones, and how do you make sure that everybody has a voice, and to keep different perspectives onto the table? That was a big challenge, and sometimes was difficult.
Yeah.
In many ways, I would say that European foundations tend to be quite parochial. They're very much caught into their own society and need to be exposed in some ways to what's going on elsewhere.
Yeah.
We tried to do that, and I wouldn't say that I was really all that successful. My successor at Philae, I think, is having an easier time of getting people to pay attention to outside of Europe. Partly because COVID and the war in Ukraine has provided a prism for foundations to look at things differently.
Yeah.
So it's not really you can't take personal credit for it. It's the situation has changed.
Yeah. I'm also interested to talk to you a bit about your time as the representative of the Ford Foundation in Southern Africa. You came in at a time when South Africa was, just getting into the democratic state, but also transitioning from the most oppressive regime that I think any country can ever have. How was that? How were the first years, in South Africa, but also looking at the region? What were some of the pressing issues at the time?
So South Africa was a fascinating time. I, of course, was in South Africa when I was working for the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. I spent a lot of time in South Africa, right on the cusp of the transition. So I came before apartheid ended, and I was working in the country, making grants to projects in South Africa. And I got to know, if you like, the context, but I wasn't part of the Ford Foundation then.
Yeah.
And the person who ran the Ford Foundation was a man called John Gerhardt. And he was really quite an exceptional leader. He was the first representative. And I think Ford established some really great programs right from the beginning. So what I inherited as the second rep in South Africa was a series of programmatic lines. We added a few. I ended up bringing in a person to do work on HIV/AIDS because Ford didn't have it. But the concentration on governance, on politics, on higher education, and that collection of focuses was very relevant. If I would critique the work that was there before I came, it was very siloed, right? So that Ford had this incredibly forward-thinking way of working. They would bring in a program officer who was a specialist, usually an activist in the field. That person got a budget, and they more or less could do what they needed to do. They would end up funding projects they knew. They ended up focusing on that, but they became very siloed. And I felt that this was very strange because we were working in one country with the same context.
Yeah.
And so with the help of some of the program officers, we developed a kind of foundation, Southern Africa office-wide focus on what we called household viability, where we were saying that it was really important in South Africa was the fact that people needed a particular kind of support that had to do with gaps in the repertoire that had been caused because of apartheid.
Yeah.
And in fact, most of the program officers, not all, but I had, I think, 7 program officers, 6 of them at least, pooled their money together increasingly to make grants collectively. And I thought that was a big shift. That was really important. And I think that's when you and I met, probably.
Yes, actually, we met at that point, and the rest is really history, because out of that time, I've really gone to learn a lot from you, from Akwasi, from Tade, and many others that I met in that very first meeting which you organized in Ginger, which has led to so many things. I mean, the book that Tade and I edited, the formation of so many of the institutions that I'm part of, it all because of that encounter in your office when you asked me to write a paper on philanthropy in Southern Africa. And that really shaped everything for me, and this is where we are But as we were coming in here, I was mentioning that the Ford Foundation will be, in Southern Africa will be turning 30 years. And in those 30 years, you know, there have been different moments of the Ford Foundation and its intervention. I know you left before the 30-year period, but you know, there's this reading that I make when I go through some of the writings and some of the experiences, that the foundation, among others, has actually been one of the most important, I would say, interlocutors in the region when it comes to whether it's issues like you mentioned HIV and AIDS, but it's issues of leadership, the judiciary, etc., etc. And I know that when you were there, you were also instrumental in the, I don't know whether it's the setup or the contribution around the constitutional court. You know, I wanted us to maybe to talk a bit about some of those key moments and successful, you know, initiatives such as this constitutional court.
That's interesting because you're reminding me of a couple of really important things that happened, and I think Ford should know these, and I don't know if there's anybody there who would remember, but I had a meeting with Madiba just before I left South Africa. Malusi Mapulwana arranged for me to have tea with him. It was the greatest privilege of my life, to be honest. And I remember having tea with Madiba, and he thanked me, and he went to his bookshelf and he took out his own personal copy of his book, an illustrated version, and he wrote on it, "Thank you for all the support." And he was talking to me as the Ford rep, so he was really thanking Ford, and he was very conscious, for example, of how much Ford had done. And this is why 30 years is not really the benchmark. Because people like Alice Brown, who was my deputy at Ford, and who succeeded me as the director, she had been working on South African stuff for a good 10 years or 5 years before that, and therefore Ford had been actually committed to doing things in South Africa long before. And there used to be, of course, an office in Zimbabwe, and they also had some relationships with South Africa. So the 30 years is just when they were able to have a physical office, but they've actually been doing very important things at very critical times. And I hope they remember that, because that's a very important part of their history. And indeed, I had access to the top government officials in South Africa. They took Ford seriously. They understood what Ford was trying to do. And I'll never forget, I used to get a phone call from one particular man who was giving me a lot of trouble because he wanted money from Ford. And he thought we were part of the government. He thought that we were spending South African government money. So he thought I had an obligation to give him money. And I had to try and explain to him, look, we're not part of the government. It's our decision who gets money. And in this case, your project just doesn't fit what we're doing. But that taught me how closely people saw us in terms of certain government programs. And it was something you have to be careful about, because you asked me where was South Africa when I was there. We could begin to see, I mean, Thabo was a great president, and he was president while I was there, but then Jacob became president. And you could begin to see some of the deterioration, if you like, from the very high standards that Madiba kept. I think you could begin to see some changes there. And that became, I think, increasingly complicated. I think in addition to that, Franklin Thomas, who was the president of the Ford Foundation before Susan Beresford, he had a very strong relationship with South Africa. And so when one of the things I think I was probably helpful in trying to do was trying to talk to the other American foundations working in South Africa, so Mott, Open Society, and also Kellogg. So we became very close. We would even sometimes have retreats together with the other foundations. So we ended up actually beginning to see that we had similar interests. And when Albie Sachs came to us for the Constitutional Court, he found 4 American foundations that were willing to pool resources together in order to make sure that that Constitutional Court happened the way he wanted it. And we were looking mostly at the artwork. But that was partly because the 4 foundations had found each other and didn't see each other as opposition or as opponents.
Yeah, and if my memory serves me right, it was also during that time that the foundations that you have mentioned also came together to support an initiative around community foundations.
Yes.
Again, another key moment for me, because the community philanthropy then becomes one of the key important areas to actually demonstrate how communities themselves can actually, be in charge of their own lives. And the rest is now we even now have the Global Fund for Community Foundations and community-like foundations that have come up in different countries. Some of them including the very old ones like the Foundation for Development in Mozambique, the Community Foundation of the Western Region in Zimbabwe, etc., etc. Again, what drove you and the other foundations to support that area?
So, I mean, I have to confess that I inherited the initial grants that were made for community foundations in South Africa, and I will be honest, I didn't like them very much because I thought that they were done in the wrong way. And the partnerships that seemed to exist were partnerships between the Ford Foundation money and white business in South Africa, right? So that it was really interesting to see that where there had been a pooling of funds to create community foundations, the people still calling the shots in that community foundation tended to be the people who would always call the shots. And I didn't feel that this was a representation of what local people's agency was. And so, in fact, I got into a lot of hot water because I tried to, together with Krista Cooligan, who was with Mott, trying to say, look, we need to see more diversity on your board. We need to see different people making the decision. Your grants need to go to different kinds of groups. And that was a very tense relationship. And some of those are still around. Some of them worked very well. KwaZulu-Natal, I think, may still be around. There was something in Cape Town, Rustenburg, and so on. But these were predating, and my critique of that is that at that time there was such a strong sense of what a community foundation should feel and look like, almost by imposition, almost following a formula. You have to have an endowment. You have to have a board. You have to have a relationship with local business, etc. And none of the things that I think Jenny and others have done now, which is to recognize what's already there. Who is coming together? Who is doing things for the community? And so I think the position on community philanthropy has changed significantly. Partly your research, partly the things you have been writing, partly the way you've been teaching it. I think the mind is much more open about what a community foundation should be. And it's less about having an endowment and fulfilling all the prescriptions that at that time were being imposed by, I would call them purists, who saw community foundations only in one way. And I think I helped move that agenda along, partly because I'm in love with something that ordinary people have agency with. I'll talk about this a little tomorrow. But things that really ordinary people do for themselves, burying their loved ones, pooling resources together to send somebody to school, taking care of a family that's just lost a bereaved person. These are the things where African communities come together and pool resources anyway. And these are examples of community philanthropy that I think we have overlooked in the past and we haven't validated enough. And agency is in that kind of thing has been set aside for a formula, I think, that actually probably fits a capitalist universe but doesn't fit the context that we're in. But I mean, frankly, I think in speaking to you, I feel a bit embarrassed because I think you know so much more about this than me, and you've written about it. So it's silly for me to be preaching to you about this.
No, but it's not even about preaching to me or anything. I think the good thing is that, it's always best to get different perspectives. But also, I think the reason why I really wanted to talk to you is because at times we really don't get to speak to people that have been doing this thing for the longest time. And yet there's so much wisdom, so much experiences and lessons that they have. And you are one of those people that, for me and many others,
Well,
we
thank
really,
you.
we really,
I appreciate that. I'm a bit embarrassed by it, but
Yeah.
let me just give you one example. I was giving this yesterday to somebody, to the lady from Pussy Power. Who
Yes,
we
yes,
were
Rachel,
talking,
Rachel,
Rachel. And in 1971, 72, late 60s, a group of peasants living in a place called Walamo began to see that there was a asphalt road they could attach themselves to, so they could get produce to market. And they pooled their resources, they got their intellectuals living in the city to help, they raised funds, they raised private, simple money in order to build an asphalt road to meet with the main asphalt road into Addis.
Yeah.
And they succeeded in doing this. And this is something called the Walamo Alamganna Road Construction Association.
Yeah.
And it's such an example of where ordinary people have done something, and there are no books to celebrate this. There's nobody's telling the story of how these people actually elevated their community by themselves. And so I think researchers like yourself should be trying to tell that story of successful agency on the part of local community, which I think the models we work with always assume that these people have no agency, have no resources, and don't know what to do. And we use words like empowerment too much, right? We're going to empower them.
Capacity building.
Capacity building, all that stuff.
Yeah. Which is a good segue for me now to maybe ask you a bit about your thoughts around the state of philanthropy in Africa and / African philanthropy, because even though you've been operating at a global level, you have also been locally grounded as well. And we are here at this conference where the theme is really looking at philanthropy at an inflection point. I don't think there is any conclusive fact that we're at an inflection point, but just to get your thoughts about the state of philanthropy globally, but also
but we are. I mean, we heard it this morning, and I thought the way in which the sequence went this morning is very correct. Let me just focus on two things. One is that the keynote speaker said it today. The fact that COVID happened, and the fact that the Ukraine war happened, and what came out of that, the hypocrisy of double standards, the lack of capacity to recognize that other people have to do things in a slightly different way, the dependency on grain growth and so on. All of this has surfaced, I think, an absolute need to recognize what Africa has on the continent completely separately and differently in a less dependent way. And I think it has put in a very strange way, in a way that probably we couldn't have predicted, African philanthropy on the map. And this is the time to take advantage of that, and to do it with confidence. Africa has a different relationship with philanthropy. And maybe philanthropy is the wrong word. I mean, I'm struggling with all these words now because but Africa has a tradition of caring and giving and solidarity that it now needs to capitalize on, because it's actually good at it. And it has done this in successive ways, and somehow we need to persuade our governments. This is, I think, the challenge now, is how do you persuade politicians and others that philanthropy is a force for good, and that actually creating more philanthropies with, for example, confiscated resources or resources that are stuck. How do we convince them that that's a good use of resources? And it means a marriage between government sort of support to the community and the work that foundations do. So it needs a kind of new partnership. And looking to the United States or Europe, where essentially these bodies have nothing to do with each other, is the wrong place to look. And we may need to look at China, where in fact the Chinese philanthropic institutions work hand in glove with government. And maybe this is one of the things we need to think about in Africa. It's sort of the way forward. So I've been toying with the idea, shouldn't we be talking more to Asian philanthropies? Because maybe we have more in common with them in terms of the relationship with government and what's possible than the US and Europe.
Right. And of course, I think the recent, the BRICS as well, which is your Brazil and many countries in the global south, could be also another opportunity.
Absolutely.
I'm about to end the conversation with you, but I think for most people, we always want to know, all of us have different moments when we realize we've been hit by the philanthropy bug, whether it's from the perspective of giving or the perspective of practice and others. In your case, what is it that prepared you to play the roles that you played in all these philanthropic institutions? Because I know we've covered the Ford Foundation, we've covered the EFC, TrustAfrica, but there were other institutions before that I know when we were still at the board of TrustAfrica, we would talk about.
So I mean, the honest answer to that is my first job was an accident, right? I was an anthropologist who had studied essentially a part of Ethiopia that had been occupied by Somali troops, and they were refugees. And somebody offered me an opportunity to go look at refugees Somali refugees in Somali camps on the Ethiopian side of the border that had been in refugee camps some of them had been in refugee camps of one kind or another for over 10 years. And I was supposed to be helping UNHCR with something called self-sufficiency packages. They were meant to get a package and then they would go back to their lives. And I went to talk to some people in a place called La Faisa, a refugee camp. And the women that I was talking to were laughing at me. They just laughed. I mean, when I said, you have this package and you can go back, and they just started laughing. And then they called their children and they said, you see this child doesn't know the difference between a goat and a dog. He's never seen a dog or a goat.
Yeah.
They've been living in this refugee camp all their lives. You want me to take this child back to being a nomadic pastoralist? Is that something that is normal? And I just realized immediately, it became instant, that the package was not suitable for these people. They weren't going to take it, they weren't happy. And so I managed to persuade UNHCR and Oxfam and others that we should change the package, and UNHCR in fact changed the package. And people were either going to get some resources to be able to sort of have a peri-urban life, or they were going to be given a proper herd of goats and sheep, because some farmer had designed the package so they would get a donkey, a goat, a sheep, and a cow. They didn't know what a donkey was themselves, never mind their children. And they didn't have any use for a cow. But they did have a use for lots of sheep and goats. So that kind of, I suddenly realized that my academic learning had taught me to talk to people and listen better to what it was they were saying. And I didn't need to, and I could use that. So that's how I stayed in this business, and I ended up sort of never leaving.
Right. And your writings also have also been channeled along those lines. And so as we end, I wanted to ask, I know you're now an independent consultant, but you're also doing some reflections and teaching at CAPSI, but writings as well. I know at some point you were busy with the history of your grandfather. You feel free to talk about that process. I always found it fascinating listening to the stories of what you were discovering. I just wanted to get a sense of.
Well, I've had a unique opportunity to get into a colonial mind. In a way that very few people do, because I've managed to read 13 volumes of my great-grandfather's diary. He was an Italian colonialist who was an engineer. He built the first bridge over the Nile, the river in Ethiopia. But he also was an ambassador. He was also a spy. He was many things. But he kept a daily diary, and it's been an incredibly important way of learning how people think, and how they can hold mutually exclusive views at the same time. So in one moment this man is racist, the next minute he understands He's condescending 1 minute, he's extremely arrogant 1 minute, and then he's humble in another. It's very interesting to see a person have and it's helped me understand colonialism actually, from the point of view of what made the colonial servant so dogged in the way they do things, and so it's been a very fascinating journey. I've ended up deciding not to write about him, but to try and write about his daughter, who was my grandmother, because she had also a fascinating life, and her mother was a slave who had been sold in the market to this man. So it's a very interesting story, and I'm trying to find the time to write it. But I'm also trying to write. I'm going to say some of this tomorrow, but I'll say it to you now. I have become worried that I'm either going crazy, or I'm beginning to see patterns in how things are. And one of the patterns I see repeated is that we forget lessons learned. Really simple lessons are forgotten in this business. So we keep being in awe of what ordinary people do, and then we forget it. And then 3-4 years later, we're astonished at what people are able to do. And if we could just maintain the momentum, recognize what people do, and validate it, and not be surprised at their ingenuity, at their creativity, at their hard work, and validate that, I think we could change a lot of things. But I think one of the problems in our business is we revert to what's more convenient for the organizations. So in my case, I once worked with a organization that allowed me to do something, to test a hunch, that if we could keep people in their own villages, they would come through the famine better than they did before. And they trusted me enough, because I was a local person, and I understood the context, and I could make the case. They trusted me enough to let me do it this way. We did it, we were successful. At the end of the famine, in an area of 340,000 people, we had only, I think it was something like 87 orphans, partly because the children who had been orphaned had been reintegrated into their society normally, because they were living where they were. In all the places where there were camps, we ended up with huge orphan populations. So we learned that lesson. The next famine, what do you think they did? Do you think they kept people in their village, or they created camps? They created camps. So they reverted back to what was more convenient for the institution rather than the people. And I think that's something we keep doing. It's a cycle of repetition. So I don't know if that's helpful, but that's...
No, it is helpful. And in fact, I was going to say, maybe as we end, what are some of the points that you'll be addressing tomorrow? But you have already said that. But maybe, what is it that you think is making you see things that way now? Is it because of many years of learning? Is it because you have the time now to reflect without the day-to-day pressures of running an institution? Because I'm thinking, it might be useful if we do crack that, because there are so many people who might be in your position, and they might actually not be using the time to actually reflect and see things differently.
I think that's a very important question, and I don't have the answer. My part of it is I've always felt I was an outsider to almost every society. So as an outsider, you're trying to make sense of what other people are doing all the time. It means you're a bit outside and you're analyzing all the time. And I think I always brought that a bit. So I think I had that. What I didn't have was the courage sometimes to say these things, right? So that you as you're climbing the ladder and trying to get jobs and worrying about job security, sometimes you don't have the courage to say, this is just pure nonsense. What you're doing is really bad. And I think somebody said this today, how important infrastructure is, infrastructure that you're creating, where it's safe to be critical of what you see, that you don't always have to say it's the right approach, that you can ask the question, is this really the right way? And I think that's more of that is necessary. My instinct is we don't do enough of that. And especially if you're working inside an institution, you get into a kind of groupthink. You think you are right.
Yeah.
We were teasing today a gentleman at lunch about some of the theories that his organization has, and we were prodding him a little.
Yeah.
And sometimes just having that kind of a discourse is a good thing. Even though nobody's right, nobody's wrong, but it's good to have somebody interrogate the premise of your assumption. And I think that's something that you do very well, and CAPSI does. And I think that's really what's helping the African philanthropy scene.
So I don't know that this is an unfair question, but I always want to know, so what's next for Gerry? I know you're already an independent, you're working with the Africa Foundation, you're working with CAPSI. Are there any other initiatives that are occupying?
My dream would be to persuade enough people that there are resources that could be deployed for foundations on the continent that could. So I've been very interested in the work that TrustAfrica has been doing on illicit flows, because I believe that in fact if we can identify iffy money that governments control, and we can make the case, and that's the biggest, the hardest thing, to the politicians. Please think about, so Lester Solomon did this incredible piece of work on privatized foundations, and he pointed to about 500 institutions, many of them European, that have been created by foundations with iffy money, by governments with iffy money. And I would just love Africa to replicate some of that. Just a few big foundations. That, so you turn all that bad money into good money. You do something with it, and you let civil society call the shots. I would love. That's my next dream. I don't know if I'll ever see it, but I would love to put energy and time into that.
So when we started, I'm not so sure it was so hot. But I'm not so sure that was the real thing as to why I was sweating a lot. I actually think I was sweating a lot because I just realized next year will be 20 years since I came to your office and you asked me to do some work for you and the Ford Foundation. And that's what has just happened over the last 20 years. Having to work with you, mentoring me, and honestly speaking, you are my legend.
Thank you. You're very kind.
You are my legend.
Thank you.
And by the way, I can't miss the opportunity. We'll be honoring you tomorrow. Congratulations, Gerry. You really deserve it.
I don't. I don't deserve it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gerry, for gracing the episode. I was really looking forward to find a moment when I could sit down and have this conversation. You've been a great mentor to me for all these years, and I'm really wishing that you get to see the dream that we just spoke about.
Thank you.
That was Gerry Salole. He's an independent consultant, but as you heard, he's been very influential in the space of philanthropy. Thank you for watching. See you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.